look at the model of the confinement, we call them CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. And in Iowa, we have thousands and thousands of hog CAFOs. And the model is that the company owns, the big corporation owns the hogs. And they own the feed, and they market the hogs and so on. They basically have a prescription for the farmer how to take care of them. The farmer owns the building and has to take care of the manure. So, but you see, the farmers don't own the hogs. And so that model has been growing, and that concentration of the market. So, for example, economists tell us that when 4 or fewer corporations control 40% or more of a market, it starts to act more like a monopoly.
That's exactly right.
Yes, and so now we have in agriculture, in hog processing, about 70% is controlled by 4 corporations. So we're way above that. In beef production, beef processing, about 80% is controlled by 4 corporations. We look at Monsanto's of the world and in the corn and soybeans, they control 80 to 90% of the seed.
Is there even any conversation about antitrust laws being
When
brought to bear on
Obama came
this?
into power, he made a big spiel about he was going to enforce that. He was going to look at the concentration in agricultural markets. He had hearings all across the country. I went to them, and Eric Holder, as Attorney General, held them. And gradually, the pressure from the industry got more and more. And pretty soon, by the end of the hearings, they just abandoned it and left, forgot about it. The power of the corporations was so much that they couldn't stand up to them. That's the problem, is that we need like a Teddy Roosevelt to break up this kind of thing. So that's kind of forced in that way. But our policies too, our subsidies for farming commodities have gone to like corn and soybeans and crops that are not very resilient and good for the environment.
So when the subsidies are applied, the subsidies, though, are given to the big corporates. They're not given directly to the farmers anyway.
Subsidies
Is that
are
correct?
given to the farmers, but in a sense it's almost like a pass-through because the prices are low. It's almost a pass-through to the corporations because one of our biggest problems we've had over the last 50 to 70 years is that overproduction. And so our markets have always been right at the marginal and not profitable for farmers. Once in a while it'll blip up and it'll be a little profit. But because there's overproduction, and we need to have some way to manage that supply so we can have fair prices for farmers. And so it's been very profitable for the corporations. And for the hog CAFOs, they can buy corn cheap at below the cost of production, and they can feed their hogs, and they can, make their profits that way. So just kind of stepping back further, if we think about what agriculture is like today, it's not profitable for farmers. They're going bankrupt in record numbers today. It's not good for the environment, we can see that, and it's not good for rural communities. They're being emptied out. The only one it's working for is the corporations. They're doing great. The ADMs, the Cargills of the world, they're like, in a sense, they're extracting the resources out of rural communities is what's really happening. Yeah. And so when there are subsidies, they go to the farmer, but
it's like
because
a
prices
colonial process.
I call it corporate colonialism.
Yeah, that's
exactly
what it is.
Exactly. And the problem, there's a lot of problems with this, and farmers should stand up and do something, but they feel powerless, and they don't seem to have.
Also, they've been manipulated into actually enabling their abusers. They actually keep politically siding with the people who are abusing them.
Exactly, and I don't know why that is. Well, most of the farmers in Iowa, especially in western Iowa, are Republicans, and so they're voting for the things that are making it worse for them. But for what reasons? And I've been really kind of, since the 2016 election, been really kind of coming to grips with this. And to me, it's the whole Democrats' adoption of the neoliberal model of deregulation and really turning it over to the corporations. They've really turned the world over to the corporations.
So let's go back a little bit. So before 1980s, before the whole Reagan, before all this, it was crop diversification and the grazing, so that it went on all year.
Well, yeah. It's interesting. That's a good question. What was before? There was a lot of grazing, but it wasn't really as good at grazing as we do now. Now we have not only the knowledge of our ancestors, my father and grandfather, but we also have new knowledge of science. And I'm a soil scientist by training. So we have new knowledge of ecology, of plants and insects and life cycles and so on. So we know a lot more. We do grazing very intensively, and it's more productive, and it builds the soil better. And so we have new knowledge. We have both. We have the traditional knowledge and we have the new knowledge of science. So we need to apply both of those. It used to be that the conservation programs only looked at soil, ignored water quality, and ignored the bigger picture. But they're starting to come around now more. But I think they need to be married. We need to have any kind of subsidies we have for crop subsidies, which Congress has the priorities for. But they need to be contingent upon better environmental practices. So not just let farmers farm the way they want to and then pay them, just pay them. We need to, like now their crop insurance is subsidized. We need to make, if they're going to get subsidies, they need to do more conservation of the landscape. And not only just conservation, but we need to change the whole system. Remember, regenerative, and we need to make it profitable. So we need to address a couple things at once. One is that we need to address the profitability for farmers. We have to make it profitable and stable, but we can do that by more conservation, and so farmers are. We can set more land aside to fragile land, and to tie the two together. And so I think that's the way we can make it work for the farmers. Is that they need to reduce the supply. We can have, when we need more supply, we can have a grain reserve, so we have some in case there's an emergency. We can have that. So we need to tie all the pieces together and make it work so it's profitable for farmers and it's good for the landscape, and we're starting to regenerate our soil. If you look at the whole thing of regenerative farming, it's really interesting. As now we've been depleting our soils over the years, but if we start to rebuild our soils, not only will we sequester a lot of carbon in the soil, but we'll actually protect our water quality. Research shows that if we use these regenerative farming systems, we'll actually achieve our goals and exceed our goals for water quality, for nitrate reduction of loss. So that's just a side benefit. I call them side benefits. We'd also improve our wildlife habitat. We'd improve pollinator habitat, and we'd have so much more diversity in the landscape. Because in this kind of grazing system like we have, we end up with a lot of diversity and plant diversity, and makes a good wildlife habitat. And also, it's a lot healthier for the animals. Like cows, for example, they have a rumen that's made to eat grass, and we mostly have them in dairy cows, are mostly all across the country in feedlots eating corn and soybeans, which is not their natural diet, and they're not as healthy. They don't live as long. They give a lot of milk, but they're not as healthy, and the product is not as healthy. Because cows on grass, the milk is higher in omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acids, beta-carotene, and other good nutrients. And so it's interesting, if we do it right, it's better for the soil, better for soil health, and it makes it more productive, more water holding capacity, it helps reduce flooding, it more diversity in the landscape, it improves the health of the animals, it improves the health of the people, all by just doing it in tune with the natural ecological processes. And so that's the thing that it's kind of exciting to think about, that we can solve so many problems, sort of a cascade of beneficial effects, just by doing it right at the root level.
How many people among the farmers in Iowa, what percentage would you say have any interest at all in sustainable farming and regenerative?
Quite a few. There is the organization called the Practical Farmers of Iowa that has, I think, 3,000 members. They're not all farmers, but one of the things they do is they share information at conferences, and they do on-farm research on innovative practices. For example, one thing we're experimenting with is for growing soybeans is to grow a cover crop. It's planted in the fall, like it's rye, cereal rye. You plant in the fall, it grows all fall, and it winters. In the spring, it comes up and it'll grow all the way up to about this tall, and then we roll it down with a roller. I have a roller. It's a roller, a special tool, a roller crimper that lays it down flat, and it crimps it, and it basically kills it. Then it creates this mulch, and then you plant soybeans in there, and the soybeans will grow right up through the mulch. And if you do it right, they're weed free, and it's got this mulch layer which not only holds the moisture for the crop for the year and protects it from extremes of rainfall in the sun, but also it adds a lot of carbon to the soil. Because we're growing up. Now, most cover crops in Iowa, only about 2 to 3% of the corn and soybeans actually have cover crops planted after them. So that means that after the corn and soybeans are dead, like this right now, they would plant like rye or something, and then it would grow, and then it would grow in the spring again. Only a small percentage of those acres actually have a cover crop, and they usually kill them in the spring when it's about this tall with Roundup. So it doesn't really. So it doesn't do a whole lot of good for building soil. But so if you can take that same crop like we've been doing with organic farmers and growing it up to this huge biomass crop, and then laying it down and then planting the next crop right in that is tremendously beneficial for the soil. As far as sequestering carbon for climate change, it's amazing to think about this, that even today around the world we've lost about 50 to 70% of organic carbon of the soil. But even today, there's still more carbon in the soil than there is in the atmosphere. And the biosphere, all the plants and animals, the combination of the atmosphere and the biosphere together has just almost is twice as much in the soil, just about. And so that means that the soil is a tremendous potential sink for carbon. So if we start to build organic carbon, and some research shows that if we could build our soil organic carbon by 2%, we could sequester enough carbon to reduce our atmospheric from today's 415 parts per million down to 350.
So what is the role that government could play in incentivizing that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I thought about it. And I think somehow we need to have a way where the government only subsidizes regenerative growing techniques. And there's some debates about whether we should pay farmers for the amount of carbon in the soil. I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but I think that if anything, we should pay them for regenerative farming systems so that they would adopt these and continue to maintain them.
If it's a farmer that's working on land that is owned by the major agricultural corporation that doesn't do it that way, then that farmer really has no choice.
Well, but
so you're,
okay.
or do they?
Well, most farm land is owned by the farmers.
By the farmer.
Or by a landlord who, maybe it's a family of a previous farmer who retired or died or something. But the corporations haven't really, they mostly have monopolized the animal agriculture. They haven't really bought a lot of farmland yet.
Okay.
It's like one guy said, why should they own the farmland when they can own the farmers?
Okay. Exactly.
So they've got a way to do that.
Exactly. For the farmer who owns his or her own land, is there an argument that they might come up with that they can't make this transition to regenerative because it would cost them too much?
Well,
or is in fact there more money to be made with regenerative if in fact the government subsidizes?
Well, that's a good question. When over time, if you start to use these regenerative practices, your soil becomes more productive, and your need for inputs will decline. But there's that time lag.
Okay.
And
how many years are we talking about?
Well, some would say 5 years, 3 to 5 years it would take before you start to see the benefits really accruing in the soil. But the biggest excuse people will use for not doing things like cover crops is it costs. But even when we subsidize a lot of the cover crops, and still farmers don't really follow through, it takes doing something different. I mean, they're kind of used to a prescription where they can plant their crops, they can call the local ag store and tell them, come and spray it, for the weeds. And so they've got a very simple system. And a lot of them love that, and they don't want to make it more complicated. And so if you're going to do something more in tune with nature's ecology, it's going to be more complicated. But it can be a lot of fun, to be able to work with it and to see how it's working and keeping on trying to fine-tune it over time.
And I think in terms of governmental policy, we could have coaches, regenerative coaches.
Absolutely, and demonstration
come out
farms.
And for free, right.
Demonstration
show you
farms.
How, mentor
Yes.
you in making that transition.
Yes. That would be definitely part of it. And that could be part of like this $2 billion budget that USDA has, is not only to do research to get the techniques better developed, but also to have these huge demonstrations all across the country so people could see it. Because that's where farmers learn a lot from each other, from seeing what somebody else is doing. And there's a certain amount of peer pressure, we're organic, and it's not as bad as it used to be, but when I started farming organically in the 70s, it was like, those weirdos over there doing something weird. And so people don't want to be, farmers talk in the coffee shops, and they don't want to be the weird person talked about in the coffee shop. So we need to make it more acceptable by funding it. And organic was considered weird until about 2002. There was federal funds available for research in organic farming. Suddenly, all the researchers who thought it was kind of crazy were out there trying to get money for their research. And so it became much more credible very quickly. And the sustainable agriculture research budget started in 1988, I believe, and it grew gradually over the years. But the organic research budget it's been growing pretty fast. And I don't accredit it to any president. It's Congress and all the environmental groups pushing Congress to try to increase that.
Is there anything else that you would do when you're Secretary of Agriculture? Is there any other policy prescription that I should know about?
Absolutely. And I was on the National Organic Standards Board for 5 years. I just got off about a year and a half ago. And we've had a problem with that. Over the years, the industry lobbyists have gotten in the back door of USDA and have pushed to weaken the standards. And there have been a number of them. For example, organic dairy farms are required to graze, and they have a minimum threshold of at least 30% of their food has to come from grass during the summertime grazing season. Well, there are big dairies out west that obviously aren't doing it. They have 5,000 cows or 10,000 cows in there. There's no way they can be grazing to that extent. There was an origin of livestock rule. I'm sorry, well, there was that too. But there was an animal welfare's rule that the organic community worked on for about 10 years. And it would set standards for things like chickens. having that access to outdoors, and a whole range of things. But that was the biggest one, because now we have these huge poultry operations that 100 or 200,000 birds in one building, and the rules say they have to have access to the outdoors. Well, they have these little porches. They're concrete porches that they have doors open, and they could go out theoretically, but there's 200 birds in there, and they just don't get out there.
So on top of everything else, you have a cruelty to animals issue there.
Yes, we do. We have an humane treatment of animals, and the thing is that we had this whole standards all in place, and the Obama administration, they dragged their feet, didn't get it through. So what happened? Suddenly Trump got elected in 2016, and the Obama administration panicked, and they pushed it through, and they had a date in January to get it implemented. Well, Trump came in, and the first thing he did was canceled it, and so that's been thrown out.
We'll put them back.
Yes, we do need to put that back.
We'll put them back.
So that's one thing that a Secretary of Agriculture could do, is totally straighten out. Another thing is with hydroponics. The organic standards talk about soil and how we build soil with organic farming, and it's in the law, it's in the standards, and it's the mindset of organic farmers. Well, there was this big push to allow hydroponic to be certified organic, growing in a bucket of water basically, and then, you don't sequester any carbon there, you don't build soils, and they got their wish. So USDA now allows organic certification of hydroponics, and you don't know it. If a consumer goes into the grocery store and it says organic tomatoes, it's very likely that those organic tomatoes are hydroponically grown, and there's no label that will tell you if it is or not. So tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, berries, a lot of the berries are hydroponically grown. And so they're growing in these pots in these big, plots of land with no soil really doing anything. And that's the original organic farmers are very much against that. Not that we're against hydroponics, that's fine, but it's not organic farming.
So explain to us, what does that mean in terms of the health of the food when it's grown hydroponically?
Nobody seems to know what the health of the food is. And we can measure the nutrients, and they can put different nutrients in the bucket of water, so they can, they can reinforce those. But I get a little esoteric here, but if you look at food, traditionally in Ayurveda, for example, food has prana. In Chinese medicine, it has qi energy. In Japan, ki energy. And so, and in the Western world, it was like vitality until that got thrown out. It was too, esoteric. And so there could be a lot more to food than what we can measure with our gadgets. And so I think it's important that we just respect that food should be grown in soil.